Welcome back. This is the last topic in our Native American history unit. And like I said, this really is sort of the next chapter in what we discussed in our past class today as we talk about the Red Power movement of the 1960s and early 1970s, and then the Indian Civil Rights Act of 1968. We'll start with a prayer. And what about dear Leah? Would you offer that prayer for us? Thank you very much.
Dear Heavenly Father, we are so thankful for this day, and we're thankful for all of our many blessings. We're thankful that we're able to be here today in this wonderful class, and for what we're able to learn here, and we're thankful for the spirit that we're able to feel here, and please help us that we can gain as much more knowledge as we can, and that we can use the knowledge that we learn and use it in our daily lives. And we love you so very much, and we say these things in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Thank you very much, Leah, for that prayer. Well, friends, I'd like you to do some very, very serious reasoning for a moment. You'll see this next slide or two are really just very chilling in what they can teach us. We have a real opportunity to learn some powerful lessons from the past right here. And so I'll ask you to reason. What's the lesson? What is the lesson implied by all of this? Given what we just talked about with the welfare state solution to the problems in Native America, here are the consequences to that welfare state solution. And what would you reason that teaches you? In the 1960s and early 1970s, Native Americans joined other minorities in a cultural revolution of self-expression, political activism, and militancy, all in the name of freedom, equality, and power. Red Power, as the movement would be called, sought to address the grievances of Indians who by the 1960s were the poorest, unhealthiest, and least stable minority group in the United States, and in an astounding reversal from dominating the continent 500 years earlier, less than 1% of the population. Nearly half of all Indians lived on reservations. Native joblessness was 10 times the national average, and the average Indian family earned $1,000 less than the average African American family. Indian life expectancy was 20 years lower. 20 years lower. This is an average of 20 years lower than the national rate. Indian suicides occurred 100 times more frequently than white suicides. And as a result of the federal government's termination and relocation policies begun in the 1950s, which attempted to remove, so notice, we talk about the flip-flopping that we mentioned before, attempted to remove the government's special services for Indians, and which funneled thousands of Indians into cities in the name of, look at the new word on the street, assimilation. So the whole point of the Indian New Deal was to reverse assimilation. And now here we are, and we're funneling Indians into cities in the name of assimilation. Native peoples felt the federal government had left them without the tools or the power to decide their own futures. What would you reason? There are some powerful lessons here. I'd love to spend some time talking about them and relating them as well. Please, Isaac.
It almost seems like we were in such a hole with Native Americans that we just skipped them all together. And like black, like the whole black versus white thing, that was a really big deal. And we never really, like we think in Indians and we never think of what they actually went through and what they're still going through. And it's just kind of one of those little holes that we just skip right over.
Okay, thank you for that. Anybody else? Lessons to reason from those consequences that we just read. Please, Brenda.
A reason that the IRA from the last lesson didn't really help. I mean, it helps a little, I guess you could say, but it didn't do nearly as much as it said it would do. And now here are all these Native Americans years later who aren't getting where they want to be. And yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Brenda. Great job. Anyone else? Other lessons? What does this teach us? Please, Caleb.
I think one of the things is that when you give the government your power, that power can be taken away whenever the government feels
Sure.
like it's better for them or it's better for you by their opinion.
Right.
And we see this here as they attempted to remove the government's special services for Indians. So everything they were then relying on because they changed how they were living,
Mm-hmm.
well, that then got taken away
Yes.
and we're changing everything again. So
Sure.
power to the government never, ever means more freedom in the long run,
Mm-hmm.
ever. And I think it just happened a lot faster for them because people probably didn't care so much about their circumstances.
Thank you. Thank you. I love that. Friends, think about this. I really love my little son, Danny. I love all my children, but he's the baby right now. And so as I was reading last night, I had him in my arms, and I was looking at him and he was smiling at me. And he does this thing where when I make this noise with the back of my throat, he loves it. He giggles, squeals, does the same thing. He goes, we're going back and forth, he is the greatest thing for him. Anyway, and I was just looking at him saying, oh, I just love carrying you around, because boy, it's so great for me. It seems to be great for you. You seem pretty happy. But can you imagine if I felt that for his own good, I should just carry him around for the rest of his life, and then I die and the poor child doesn't even know how to walk. He can just sort of roll around on the ground. I mean, you think about this idea of we'll carry you. We're the government. We will just carry you for your whole life. And then suddenly, notice, they cut off the carrying and the Indians can't even walk. They are on the ground trying to drag themselves forward, so to speak. This is an image. This isn't literal, but figuratively speaking. This is a really interesting thing. Thank you, Caleb, for that great insight. Welcome, Manoa. Great to have you. How old are you?
I'm 9.
You're 9? Well, you are a beautiful 9-year-old. It's great to have you in this class. Friends, what else would you read? What other lessons? Please, JT.
Well, it's probably just a culture shock again.
Sure.
Because it's happened, well, it just keeps happening for the Indians.
Yeah.
First, we show up, we attack them, then we take their land, then we tell them to move, we tell them to join us, then we say we'll help you, they accept, and then we don't help them. Just the trust is, I feel, completely gone.
Sure.
And that's probably why they still don't trust us today.
Sure.
So.
Thank you. Thank you for that, JT. Thank you. Anybody else? Other lessons here? Please, Isaac.
One of my really good friends has cousins that go to a Native American school.
Yeah.
And it's just hard for them because they don't have a social life. I mean, they're really close in their little groups.
Yeah.
But then outside of their little groups, they're kind of just nobody, and they don't have any self-esteem. They don't have any confidence in themselves.
Thank you. Great observation. Thank you for that. Anyone else? Lessons. The Zen life. I feel like you've got a lesson back there for us.
Well, the thought.
We've got a microphone, I'm sure. Thank you so much.
Very short thought. You can't go back.
Mm-hmm.
The damage was done, and to repair that damage would be huge and take far, far longer than it was to rehabilitate them.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Thank you. So friends, here's where these are all great. I want to spend just a moment, though. I want to do some relating, because my question is, when have you seen either? By the way, if this is something that's personal, you don't need to mention someone's name. You can say, I know a person who. We can protect anonymity. If it's something you're happy to share, then obviously you can mention yourself. But as we talk about this, I'd love to relate this and say, when have you seen that what happened to the Indians can happen in our own lives, in our own families' lives, in the lives of friends and others we know? Or, on the other hand, when have you seen the opposite and how it really is better to follow God's plan versus a plan of force? When have you seen either the first or the second? I'd love to hear some real life examples, because I think this is important that we understand today. We are not just here talking about native tribes, because I don't know about you. I don't, as far as my knowledge goes, I don't have any Native American blood in me in terms of these tribes that we're talking about. I'm not Navajo, I'm not Sioux, I'm not Cherokee, etc. And I don't know if you have any Native blood in you. But regardless, I hope you know that these lessons, these principles, this is about how we raise our families today. This is about how we help people in our callings in church. Right? This is about how we vote in elections. This is about how we talk with neighbors about solutions to neighborhood problems. I mean, this is absolutely at the core everything in our lives. Everything in our lives has to do with what we're talking today. So my question is, when have you seen either exactly what we're talking about just in your own life in some way, or the opposite and how it should be done, how it could be done if we focus on internal solutions rather than external solutions? Please, love to hear some stories.
When I was growing up, I had quite a bit of contact with the family of my mother's older sister. And I just got the feeling that those parents would kind of force their children to live gospel principles.
Sure.
Force them to fast when they didn't want to. Force them to read scriptures.
Yeah.
Just a lot of, and I kind of felt that myself coming from them when I'd be in their home.
Yes.
The way they treat me if I did something they didn't like,
Right.
that type of thing. It was just really a
Yeah.
kind of a tension-filled
Mm-hmm.
environment.
Mm-hmm.
And when a lot of their children got out on their own,
Mm-hmm.
when they'd been forced
Right.
to eat certain ways,
Sure.
or, they just kind of went hog wild on,
Yeah.
oh, now I'm in society, I've got, all this other
Right.
freedom. And, several of them went on missions,
Right.
but they'd come home from their mission and meet a Catholic at a bar and
Yeah.
marry the person and
Right.
not really be united. Anyway, just
Sure.
I could see that a lot of the problems that were perpetuated in the family were because of the resentment of forcing them to live gospel principles. And I think it's helped me to, maybe as a father, to not use that type of heavy-handedness.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you so much. Oh, wonderful example. Anyone else? Please, Brenna.
So this isn't a specific example, but
Sure.
kind of demonstrating like how carrying someone can cripple them.
Yes.
I'm just kind of thinking how more and more missionaries have to come home because they don't know how to work it or they can't handle the workload.
Yes. Oh, I love that. Thank you so much. And speaking about dependency on external forces, we had a training yesterday at my seminary, and it was from MTC trainers. These are adult women. They've both been on missions, but now 25 maybe, somewhere in there, 23. And their job at the MTC is to work with missionaries to detach from cell phones, because they are addicted to cell. They even have little wooden mock phones that they keep in their pocket because they feel that they can't even be without the weight of what used to be their phone in their pocket. They can't function. And so they have a little piece of wood. This is like a nicotine patch to help somebody stop smoking, right? This is crazy. But yet, this is something they're doing in the MTC now. They said that they have these courses, to help people with acceptable technologies, because obviously there's some missions, I think 87, 85, something like that in the world right now that have the use of digital devices, if it's an iPad, that kind of thing. And Kathy is in one of these missions. What has she said about the training they've received? Has she mentioned that this has been hard for some missionaries? Has she said, has it just been easy to do? I'm sure she's a self-governed young woman, but I'd love to hear your perspective, because essentially they shared some things. It was unbelievable. They said, you need to know that, when you feel tempted to use technology inappropriately, you have to have a plan. And I mean, it was so specific because people are struggling so much with just using tools to move forward the Lord's work and not messing around on them.
Well, it's interesting that Kathy has never mentioned it. She's always
Yeah.
kept the rules.
Yes.
Although it made us chuckle because in Karen's mission, the mission president came down to this really hard and fast rule. He said, we understand
Right.
that some parents and missionaries are deciding the time they're going to be on the internet, and they actually pass back and forth questions. And I thought, oh, for heaven's sakes,
Right.
this is so funny.
Right.
They were so fearful
Right.
of someone breaking the rule. And I don't know, Karen has never received one, and so has never
Sure.
mentioned it, but Kathy has been true every time. Sometimes her mission president seems a little more encouraging self-government.
Yes.
And so, like, one day when they had women's conference, she says, oh, our president said we can text our mom real quick and just tell her we love her and we're watching women's conference. Or some little thing like
Right,
that.
right.
Allowed them to do something good with this.
Yeah.
But she's never broken it otherwise. And so I think because of that perspective of being trusted with it,
Yes.
that she's done great.
Oh, I love that. And I'm happy to hear that because I think from that conversation yesterday, you would have thought that not a single young man or young woman can govern their technology use when they come into the MDC. And I'm thinking, wait, what are we coming to? You know? So, yeah, thank you for that. Whoop, happy to hear that. Anyone else, though, with an example about ways to live? Force versus choice, right? God's way internally, right? Working through Christ to help people to then change their external environments, or let's just force them externally. Yeah, Caleb.
I think one of the things is whenever someone is forced to do something, it can promote change, but it's usually in the opposite direction of whatever you want.
Okay.
It's really hard to force someone to do something where they say, oh yeah, no, I'm totally going along with this because, I've been forced, so it's great. So I think it's an interesting case study to look at when our country, since this time, has gone more and more down this path with everyone else.
Sure.
Be it healthcare or gay marriage or whatever, where it's just said, okay, well, this is how it's going to be now. And no matter what people want, it's just the way it is. And so it's a little bit of an unnerving thought to see this has happened to the Native Americans and what's going to happen to our society. So understanding that we have to live in that kind of a society, but keeping our self-government and our families on the right path and knowing that, okay, well, this is wrong and, we're in this country and that's how it's going to be for everyone else, but that doesn't mean that's what we believe.
Sure.
So keeping strong that way and understanding that just because it's forced doesn't mean that has to be the way it is.
Okay. Thank you for that. Thank you for that. Please, Gordon.
So Caleb's comment kind of reminded me of Newton's law. With every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. If you're forcing them, then they're probably just going to shoot back the other way.
Okay. Thank you. Well said. Well said. Please, Camilla.
This reminds me of something that happened to me and my friends. We went to something at the library, and we thought it was something different than what it actually was. And so eventually we were like, well, this is kind of a waste of time. And so we wanted to leave. But then when we tried to leave, they told us that we weren't allowed to leave. And before that, it hadn't been like a we have to get out of here situation. But I noticed that as soon as they were like, no, you have to stay here, everyone started freaking out. And they're like, we have to get out of here. And it just became like a life or death situation. As soon as you're prevented from doing something, it was like you were gonna die or something.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Interesting comment. Love that. Please, Caleb. And then Mr. Anderson.
So kind of with Camilla's comment there, you don't realize what you've given up until you try to get out of what you are now in.
Yes.
So it's really easy to slip. Think about from their situation where they're with the IRA, they accepted it, they have education now, they have jobs, all these things, until either they want to get out of it or someone else decides that, oh yeah, we're done.
Right.
So once you've given up that power, then you're in a really, really scary place.
Yes. Thank you so much for that. Please, Mr. Anderson.
I guess I want to give an example of my mother.
Yes.
When I was a teenager, maybe 14 or 15 years old, I got invited to go to a movie by my cousins of this same family.
Sure.
And I hardly ever went to movies, and this was, I guess, a PG movie, and I don't know if I'd ever been to any of those.
Right.
But my mother made 2 or 3 attempts by the principles of persuasion
Yes.
and, long suffering
Right.
and kindness. She tried very hard to get me to not go to that.
Right.
She said, I don't think you should, but in the end, she let me choose.
Right.
I went, and that was a powerful experience to me, because when I got out of that, I thought that was a dirty movie. That was terrible.
Right.
I'm going to do what my mother says from now on,
Right.
that type of It
Sure.
was a really great learning experience.
Yes.
Whereas had she forced me and said, you can't go, it would have deprived me
Yeah.
of that valuable learning experience.
Right. Rather than an opportunity that drew you closer to the gospel, it would have pushed you farther away. You wouldn't have learned that lesson. I mean, what a beautiful example. Please, Isaac, thank you for your patience.
So it's like the law of consecration versus communism.
Yes.
It's like Satan's tool for destruction or Heavenly Father's tool for the greatest form of living there is possible. So
Wonderful. Oh, love that. Love that. Friends, it's interesting. In my house, like just yesterday, I noticed this, and I was so touched. So I may have mentioned a little bit about this, at least the first part of it. I felt like, maybe 6 months ago, my children weren't as excited about reading the scriptures by themselves. Now, granted, they are pretty young, 8 and 6 and 4 and 2, and then 4, actually 6 months now, almost 6 months. Anyway, and my wife and I were concerned, and so we said, what can we do? And so we had all these family home evening lessons on the power of the scriptures and how much they can change lives, and we were bearing our testimonies, and we tried to make sure that they could see us as we were trying to be examples. And we would discuss at the dinner table the things that we've been studying and how much, we'd always done these things, but we tried to put a little extra emphasis because we realized that, we don't know why Mia and Josh, our oldest two, weren't, for whatever, they had a period where they weren't as excited about reading on their own. They're saying, I don't feel like I understand the words, and it's more, it seemed like more of a burden to them, than a joy. And so we were worried. Well, we kept teaching, saying, well, we're not going to say, you sit in your room with the door closed until you finish the chapter. Well, that's not going to teach them to love the scriptures. And then so we didn't do that specifically. And like I think I had shared, before Mia's birthday, she finished the entire Book of Mormon for herself. And she wanted to do that. She chose to get up early. I would be leaving for work, and she was there reading the scriptures. And honestly, in the end, the last few months, she'd read. Her original goal was just a chapter a day. She was reading 3, 4 chapters because she wanted to. And this was a little girl, not even 8 years old, because she was still 7 at the end, choosing to get up early to read her scriptures. Well, it was interesting because not only has she now developed, she's halfway through the New Testament now. She just every day she just gets up and reads. She loves it. But my son, Josh, he watched his sister, and I'll never forget the day when he said, hey, is it okay if I get up early too? Because we have said we would appreciate it if you stayed in bed until 7 o'clock in the morning. We'd love for you to do that if that is possible. If not, that's okay. But he said, hey, how would you feel about me getting up early? Oh, sounds great. Thanks for asking. We've got a guideline, but now, I think if you're going to read your scriptures, that sounds wonderful. Go ahead and get up at 6:30 if you want, just like your sister. Well, he's been getting up, and now he's reading. So I came home yesterday, and he said, I was really tired this morning, but Dad, could you set the timer for 30 minutes? I said, sure, why? And he said, well, because I want to make sure that I read for 30 minutes today. That's my goal. I've decided I'm going to read the Book of Mormon for 30 minutes a day. He is 6 years old. And so I said, he was at the kitchen table. I was helping my wife with dinner, and I looked over at him. And not only was he just reading, but he had marking pencils, and he was going through and marking. And he read 1 Nephi 17, 18, and 19 in a half an hour, and marked everything that he thought was important, which was quite a lot. I was when they literally marked it. Anyway, but I was so pleased, so excited for him, because I realized that this was motivated internally, that he had chosen for himself to do that, and I just said, this is so much better than if I had forced him. Well, your sister finished the Book of Mormon before she turned 8. Now, you better stay in your room with the door locked until you come out. That would have done the opposite, as we've heard. And so I am so grateful for this principle. So with all that in mind now, as I think we've shared some wonderful things, let's take a look at also, speaking about the resentment that can come when you lock somebody in a room and tell them to do something, take a look at the resentment that manifested itself in what was known as the Red Power movement. Okay, we'll just take a look at just part of it here. Indian activists responded to these grievances in a number of ways. 1961, over 400 members of 67 tribes met at the American Indian Chicago Conference and drafted a Declaration of Indian Purpose, which called upon President JFK to grant them self-determination, the right to choose our own way of life. Later that year, younger participants in the Chicago Conference formed the National Indian Youth Council in New Mexico to demand an increased role for Indians in making the policies that affected their lives and to promote Indian nationalism and unity. Indians in the Pacific Northwest staged fish-ins, in which they purposefully fished out of season and without licenses to assert their treaty rights and publicize their grievances. So here we have these angry Native American youth, young single adult age people. This is the National Indian Youth Council demonstrating because they are angry at what had happened. Well, it's interesting because 1968 we have this daring pan-Indian organization, so across tribes, the American Indian Movement. This is AIM, and Mrs. Andelin, you had said that there was a woman who was raised by someone you knew had then gone and joined AIM. Is that correct?
She lived with us for many years,
Okay.
probably 8 or 9 years.
Okay.
She's in an Indian program.
Yes.
Indian program.
The placement.
She went back, she left the church.
Yeah. Oh, so sad. So sad. This is the program that she joined, the American Indian Movement. It began attracting young militants, meaning violent, willing to stand up for their grievances as they saw them in violent, destructive ways. And what we'll see is that they leave the cities and the reservations and they come to the cause of direct, action-oriented, and at times violent protest. Congress responded to the pressure put on them, right, by these protesting, rioting, violent, destructive groups with what you have read just a piece of, which is this really interesting document, the Indian Civil Rights Act, ICRA, of 1968, which guaranteed reservation Indians many of the rights protected by the first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution, and also recognized to an extent the authority of tribal law within reservation boundaries. So this is the interesting thing, because what you'll see is, of course, we're going to have Alcatraz, right, this violent protest, right? We're going to have the Wounded Knee issue, we have thousands and thousands of shots fired. We have people killed because they're just taking over land, saying we're not going to leave until you let us. We have the Bureau of Indian Affairs, right, just stormed and taken over by a gunpoint. And so my question is, as you think about all of this, what do you think of the Indian Civil Rights Act? Is this the solution? Is this the solution? We'll get to that in a moment. I want you to think about that, though. I want to share a quote first. This, as you may have seen before, this is the flag of AIM that you could still see today in some place. Have you ever seen one of these, by the way? Just out of curiosity. This is their flag. Here's the question that I want to ask as we take a look at this really neat quote from President Kimball. So this is December 1975. The question is this: what do you think God would have you remember from this quote by a prophet? And by the way, also too, just doctrinally speaking, I think it is known. Sometimes we don't note this, but take a look at who he calls the remnant of the Lamanites. So my appeal today is for the Lamanites, all of the Lamanites, the Mexicans, the Polynesians, the Indians, to live the commandments of God and prove themselves worthy of this choice land. And a further word of caution: keep your strength up to high purpose. Keep your eye single to the glory of God. Maintain your faith and live the principles of the gospel. Remember, the gospel of Jesus Christ is not compatible with radicalism or communism or any of the other isms. There could be those who would profess to be your saviors. We could probably think of many of those. They could enslave you with their force or their strange philosophies. If some of their leaders have motives that are selfish and questionable, have nothing to do with them. Perhaps some would even excite you to unwise actions. Beware of them. Keep your feet on the ground and your heads high. Listen to your duly elected tribal leaders. Stay with those who want independence, equality, and full freedom for the Indians by peaceful means alone. Only these kinds of successes will be enduring. And that is from a prophet of God. What an interesting thing to think about. A prophet, seer, and revelator talking to those who might be or who might be thinking of joining Indian activists like the AIM movement. These militant groups that would, through destruction and violence, would try to work toward what they thought was due them. Friends, what do you think God would have you remember here from this quote by a prophet, seer, and revelator? Speaking about the very groups that this topic addresses today. Yes. Isaac.
As children of God, we all have responsibility to keep His commandments no matter what race we are.
Okay. Thank you for that. Thank you. Anyone else? What would God have you remember? What would you reason? Please, Gordon. Oh, is that Camilla? Or
No.
Oh, okay.
So, one of the first things he says is that we need to be worthy, because this is all Heavenly Father's land,
Yeah.
and so we need to be worthy of it.
Okay. Thank you so much for that. Love that. Anyone else? Mrs. Andelin, please.
It just jumps out when it says, with peaceful means alone.
Yes. Why do you think a prophet of God would stress that, given the situation that we're talking about with these groups, the Red Power movement? He's addressing tribes.
Well, ultimately, that's the only way that works. People know when they coerce others that it's wrong, even if they don't cognitively recognize that. Deep in their hearts and their souls, they know that force, they wouldn't want to be forced. The Golden Rule teaches us that we don't like to be forced, and
Right.
no one else does either.
Sure.
And so only these kind of successes will be enduring. It will come back and bite you, just like Brad was saying.
Yes.
When you're forced to do something, it just almost puts up a harder wall.
Yeah, love that. Thank you so much. Well said. Well said. Please, Mr. Anderson.
I better read one of Uncle Verlin's favorite scriptures about this.
Wonderful.
When we undertake to exercise control or dominion or compulsion on the souls of the children of men in any degree of unrighteousness, the heavens withdraw themselves, the Spirit of the Lord is grieved. And when it's withdrawn, amen to the priesthood, or you might even add the government authority. Their authority,
Right.
they have the power
Right.
and the authority, and there will be.
Yes.
But with what beneficial effects?
Right. Oh, love that. Thank you so much for that. Anyone else? You've all been wonderful. Let me ask a question then. Who is someone you know, as we relate this, who is someone you know personally, not just, President Monson, unless he's your uncle or something, great uncle. Someone you know personally who is a really great example to you of living this way. Isaac, please.
My dad is, well, both my parents, but especially my dad, is really patient with me. And I think patience is a really good virtue in trying to teach people new ways. And he's been really patient with me as I've just grown up under his home, and I'm offered a lot of agency and consequences for wrong choices, but also agency and a lot of really good instruction on how to use it. So
Wonderful. Thank you for that. Thank you. Anyone else? Who is someone you know? Please, Brenda.
Probably my mom, just because when people get angry or anything, she doesn't get mad at them. She tries to solve the issue peacefully, and she's just a really good example to me and my siblings, and I really appreciate that.
Oh, thank you. Go home and tell her tonight. Love that. Thank you so much. Friends, this is an interesting question, and certainly I'd invite you to really consider these principles that we've been reasoning and relating. I invite you to talk about them, maybe at the dinner table, sometime tonight if you're able. If not, the invitation is always open, because really you'll see this has everything to do with the way a home works. Please, is that a finger or was that a comment? Please.
Kind of is.
Yes.
It seems to me like as we look at our history and the way our government has dealt with minorities,
Sure.
we have these little groups popping up,
Mhm.
Black Power, Ku
Right.
Klux Klan,
Yeah.
these Red Power,
Yeah.
the Hispanic cholos and Chicanos that
Yes.
kind of, spray paint on
Yes.
things. It's almost as if that's their radical reaction to feeling that they don't have free agency, that they're being oppressed and deprived of rights and
Yes.
everything that's good.
Yes.
And so I remember reading something about President Kimball when he went over, or President Hinckley when he went over to Asia and would meet with the priesthood leaders and other leaders. They said he would never try and tell us what to do or dictate. He just loved us and found good at what we were trying to do. And I thought, that's a way to keep people on the right path and motivated and strengthen their testimonies instead of going in there and, saying, well, your culture just doesn't quite, mesh with this, that, or the other, or being critical or anything like that. Love is the most powerful motivator there is. And if it's mixed with force, it sends mixed, confusing signals to people, and then they may not be motivated to do right, but rather have resentment, do the opposite reaction like Gordon said.
Oh, thank you for that really great comment. Well, friends, please, is that a comment, Isaac, or is that?
Oh, well, yeah.
Please.
So, as I've noticed, just a lot of times when we see people spray painting a message or whatever, or kids acting out of proper behavior, we as human beings, we look at it, like we'll look at that spray paint and say, oh, they just made this huge mess and they just totally destroyed this whole whatever. And we don't look at the message that it's saying. They're just crying out for help. And what they really need is compassion, and just to be sat down and said, hey, I'm sorry, and whatever. Instead, we get mad at them for spray painting the wall, and then it makes the situation worse.
Thank you very much for that. Thank you. Tip of the iceberg. Right. That spray paint. There's a whole lot beneath the surface to find out. So here's the question. I've heard the word rights come up a few times. Indian Civil Rights Act, 1968. Right? Let's go back to that for a moment. You'll see it's just a brief source, but yet there's a lot that we could talk about. So would you just flip there for a moment? Just go to that source there. I mean, just not even a full page, maybe just barely, but just shy of a page, at least in the version that I have. And yours, I assume, is probably even a little shorter, because I think my font's a tiny bit bigger than yours. But would you go ahead, as you take a look, essentially, once again, coming back to the background, right, you'll remember that the Indian Civil Rights Act of 1968 guaranteed reservation Indians, these aren't Indians living in New York City, this is, you're still on a reservation, many of the rights protected by the first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution, which you can see there, probably very familiar to you, and also recognized to an extent the authority of tribal law within reservation boundaries. Tell me, after all that we've discussed, was this the right solution? Why yes, why no? And you can certainly refresh yourself, but essentially, I mean, I could read the whole thing in probably 30 seconds. No Indian tribe, though, even though you'll have a tribal law, but yet even tribal law needs to bow to these things according to the 1968 Indian Civil Rights Act. No Indian tribe in exercising powers of self-government shall make or enforce any laws prohibiting the free exercise of religion, or abridging the freedom of speech or of press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition for redress of grievances. Then it goes on there with other rights that you're very familiar with. What do you think? Is this the solution? Please.
I think a lot of their problem was not with their tribal governments, which, I mean, that's wonderful. Now these constitutional rights are guaranteed to them in their, their tribal government shall not do any of these things under the jurisdiction of the United States. But their problem wasn't with their tribal governments. Their problem was with the way the government manipulated the systems that were supposed to help them. They accepted them because, okay, here's our help, and we'll take that. And then the government took it away. So this really, beyond guaranteeing constitutional rights, which are wonderful and everyone should have, it really didn't do much to solve the problem that they had.
Okay.
With the grievances that they were pursuing.
Sure. You have a concussion, so somebody puts a Band-Aid on your toe. Not solving the real problem. Okay, great. Now let's step back just for a moment, because I love this answer. Let's step back maybe 2 steps. So notice, no Indian tribe in exercising powers of self-government shall do this. And who's saying this? Does anybody see anything to talk about there? Please.
Maybe because I work in the court systems, but in this great country from sea to shining sea that we say in the Pledge of Allegiance with liberty and justice for all,
Yeah.
there's no caveat that says unless you're an Indian,
Right.
or unless you're not a citizen,
Right.
or unless you, swam the river or got here with whatever illicit means.
Right.
I've done a lot of trials in court for people that were not citizens, but they still have a right to trial by jury and all those other rights. It's almost laughable that they'd say, okay, all you Indians, we're going to give you the Bill of Rights that everybody else got 150 years ago.
Right. Okay.
It just.
What does that show you about how the government views Indians, as well as other minority groups that they've done similar things with? Maybe not this, but.
But they're substandard. They kind of like the blacks, you're not smart enough or humane enough to have the intelligence to vote or to hold land or whatever it might be.
Yeah, it's related to this idea of a protected class. That suddenly we now have protected classes of people who, in the way the government acts, almost have more rights, quote unquote rights, not real rights, right? Because we all come with the same backpack from God. But they are now these special interest groups, right, that are getting more government, help and protection, you name it, than others, because they're not viewed simply as humans living in this area, right? But now you're part of this group, and because you're part of this group, you get a special status. How do we feel about that? That is a huge issue, and we could really talk about that, because that's essentially what the government's doing. Oh, let's see, you have a slow connection. Would you like to hide all webcams and stop sharing your webcam if you are doing so?
May I comment while you're working on it?
You may, sure.
I've been fascinated at how even in the division of the jurisdiction of the federal government, I mean, any crime committed on a reservation, on a United States Air Force base, or any of those entities goes immediately to the federal courts to be prosecuted.
Right.
Whereas, and that's kind of a specialized group, I guess, Whereas everyone else, if they're 1 foot off of that federal property, then they're referred to the local courts, the justice, or the state courts.
Yes.
And so a lot of the work that I've done has been crimes committed on Indian reservations. They go to Montana, and they're that type of thing. So it's kind of liberty and justice for all. Everyone had the same rights. Well, with a few exceptions.
Right.
Kind of thing.
Right. Yeah.
Because the federal sentencings are sometimes 10 or 20 times as punishing as the state or the justice court was for the exact same crime.
Yes, thank you for that. Because this gets to the issue of, so let's go with quotas for education, right? as we think about people as being in certain protected, or you could say privileged classes, even though people would say that they're underprivileged classes, therefore they need to now be privileged. But the interesting thing is, really, this is the same question of, should a college admittance board say, we're going to fill a quota of 5% Asian Americans? We don't care if the Caucasian Americans are averaging a 32 on the ACT to get in. We're going to take the top Asian Americans to fulfill a quota, even if their ACT scores are 24. How do we feel about that? Because essentially, this is the type of thing we're talking about. Same thing with jobs, right? I'll give you an example. The Marine Corps. My uncle and his former wife, they're both in the Marine Corps. They're both in for over 20 years. They were both the same rank at one time. They were both majors, trying to become colonels. And they took a test. And essentially, my uncle, and I can't remember the number that it was out of, but my uncle scored, it was like a 98% on the test. He was denied. His wife scored, I think it was like an 83% on the test. She was advanced in rank. Why? They had to fill a government-mandated quota for women officers. This is the kind of thing we're talking about. How do you feel about that? Because, of course, others would say, well, but they've been, quote unquote, oppressed for so long, we need to now, make it right in this way. Gordon.
This kind of reminds me of my oldest brother. He's trying to get into medical school, and we really want him to come to Utah State because that's the closest one here. And it's actually going to be kind of hard for him to get in because they don't really want white people going there. They want other people. Yeah, the minority going there. So, yeah.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. Please, Brenda.
It's like they're sacrificing effectiveness just to claim that they are, that they're not racist or sexist
Diverse,
or whatever.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And it just makes it a lot less effective, and it's kind of still racism or whatever because they're like having people come in based on race or gender stuff.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you so much for that, Brenda. Please, Caleb.
We've become a country where political correctness dictates more of what we do than the principles of equal justice and equal opportunity under the law.
Mm-hmm.
And that departure the departure from the Constitution has only led to more of these special interest and cliquish things that we see because, okay, well, this group was privileged and this group wasn't, so we have to then help this one. Now this one's not and these ones are.
Right.
And it just goes back and forth, and really no one's happy, and then everyone's just tense with each other. It doesn't do anything to help the situation. It only makes it so, okay, well, we're in a politically correct situation, so no one can, quote unquote, target us or, say we're racist or such. But it really isn't doing anything to solve any problem. It only makes it worse.
Yeah, thank you for that. Let me share something, and this is really, I think, very interesting to wrestle with. I remember being, when I was at the school in Massachusetts where I taught for a couple years, they had essentially a diversity training program for all the teachers that it was mandated to attend, et cetera. And then part of that was we would need to read these articles about what was termed white privilege. And the whole point of the article was to say, the fact that you scored a 32 on the ACT is because you were privileged to grow up with people who could get good jobs and people who had access to education and people who were wealthy, people who lived in safe neighborhoods, et cetera. And therefore it is completely right to say that an African American applicant's 24 or whatever the score might be, that is deemed, that 24 actually is more impressive because he didn't have to overcome, or he had to overcome all of those things that you didn't have to because you grew up with white privilege. And white people in this nation need to understand the that the fact that essentially because they've been privileged for so long now, other people need to be artificially boosted up because it's not an even playing field. How would you respond to someone who would say that? If they were to walk in this class right now and say, you should not be saying the things that you're saying. There's another side to this. How would you acknowledge that other side and respond to it? Because you'll see this really will lead us into our next unit, which is an African American history unit in which people will say, your great-great-great-great-grandparents weren't enslaved, didn't live in extreme poverty with sharecropping and you name it, this, that, and the other, and didn't have to overcome not only de jure segregation, but then de facto segregation, didn't have to overcome being lynched and attacked and you name it, right? Which may be true for us. I don't know about your family trees, right? How do you respond? Please, Brenna.
Well, our Constitution gives us freedom of opportunity. So we're not all born in the same circumstances, and we may not all have the same privileges and stuff, but we all have the opportunity to rise above it and progress to something much better.
Thank you so much, Brenna. Please, Mr. Anderson.
It seems like one of the motivating forces for creating this system of government, the Constitution, was to get away from the privileges of a birthright or privileges that might be conferred by a monarch or by a government,
right,
so that people could be respected for their efforts and for their merits, the things that they'd earned by working hard and not having privileges divvied out in some capricious governmental way. And it seemed like it's going against what those main founding fathers espoused at the beginning and had as one of the motivations.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you. This is Evelyn.
I think you could tell them that in the long run, you're going to hurt that person, because when they're going to get there in those classes, if they cannot perform at the same level of those other students who are rightfully earned, they're going to suffer for their lack of knowledge, and it'd be better to encourage them to study more and then compete on the same basis, because in the long run, it won't be a blessing to them.
Right. Thank you for that. Great point. Thank you. Please, Gordon and then Caleb.
Kind of like Sister Evelyn was saying, if we favor somebody else and are biased to them, then when they get out in the real world, they really won't know anything. They'll bounce off the comforts of others and not know how to fly. They'll just fall.
Oh, thank you. Well said. Well said. Please.
Kind of similar to what Mr. Anderson was saying, when you have standards that are set up, the 32 on an ACT, that's someone who worked their tail off to do that. And regardless of what someone who gets a 24, maybe they did have to overcome. Maybe they did. And that's wonderful, and that should be rewarded. But at the same time, you're kind of setting up a game, because there is no, in the name of equality, this person should have the same because this person, had to overcome and this one didn't. Well, either way, we still have to overcome our own challenges, and who is whoever to judge who is more privileged or who had to overcome what. So equality is not something that can just be given, because when it's just erroneously given, it's not really equality.
Okay.
So when someone has to work for something, they should have to work for something, and everyone should have to work for that same thing. It shouldn't be handed out or deemed equal when they're changing what it is.
Sure. Right. And then next year, if there's another group that's on the rise, politically speaking, so suddenly they're lumped in. Now they can get in, whereas before they couldn't. And now, let's say you could get in with the 24. Now this year you can't. You're thinking, wait. Yeah. Is that equality? Please.
I think of when the the wall came down in Berlin,
Yeah.
and all of a sudden there were a half a dozen countries in the Eastern Bloc that had been living under the oppression of
Yes.
communism.
Right.
And now all of a sudden they didn't know what to do or how to handle all this extra freedom. And they're still suffering in their economies because of the mindset of the government giving them a dole. They
Sure.
don't have the initiative and the business creativity, entrepreneurialism, and things like
Right.
that has been created by the freedom in this country.
Oh, thank you for that. Thank you. Please, Caleb.
Sorry, one more thing that I could
Sure.
think of. When you have someone who is like that, when you give someone something, they then don't have that same work ethic that they had to work for something. They don't have the same satisfaction, and they don't have the same level of understanding or education. And so when you do that in an entire system, we're seeing now people think, okay, well, I'm special, and not that they're not, we all are, but
Right.
more special than someone else, so I should deserve
Right.
this.
I'm entitled to this because my grandparents suffered.
Exactly. And so then you end up with a next generation, and that generation is up the creek because they don't know how to handle the same things that the previous one did.
Yeah.
And it's a cycle that continues, and pretty soon you have a society that just doesn't work.
Sure. Thank you for that. Please.
My oldest three boys paid for basically their entire mission.
Yeah.
And their level of commitment after they'd made that money themselves was, I believe, very significantly increased.
Yes.
And there were a lot of these minor things like,
Sure.
the technology things that just were never ever even
Right.
dreamed of being a problem for them
Right.
because of their own efforts.
Yes.
And once I had an uncle that was a mission president. He came back and he told us, we can't just sit back on the laurels of our parents' and grandparents' missionary work.
Right.
We must gain our own missionary blessings by our own missionary service.
Oh, I love that. Thank you. Thank you so much. Well, friends, these comments have been just so rich. Did you have something to say, Mrs. Updike? You look like you did. So I'd love to hear from you if you'd like.
You've been blessed for reading God today.
Mike, everyone wants to read it.
When we have a Christian worldview, we reason differently. When you go to the Noah Webster 1828 dictionary and it defines reason, it includes that in that process we will employ the light of Christ. And in a contemporary dictionary, there's no mention of that. Reason is going logically from one step to the next. And as we abandon the fact that we are a Christian covenant nation and we have a mission to perform in this world, we move away from being worthy of and knowing how to obtain the light of Christ in our reasoning. And this is the kind of thing which results. We try to guarantee economic equity, and in the process we lose economic freedom because we're no longer functioning as a Christian nation.
Yes.
And the blessings of the covenant, which are freedom, prosperity, and protection, we lose.
Yes. I love that. I love that. You know, and it's reminds me of a quote I heard when I was in college. I was in a history class. It's always stood out to me. We should be careful not to confuse standard of living with quality of life. You can't give people a quality of life by improving on paper their standard of living. That is internal. It comes from Christ. He is the one who can change us. That is my testimony, that we are to come unto Christ and be perfected in him. That's the invitation. That's not forced on anybody, neither could it be. I testify that Jesus Christ is the answer to all of the ills of society. I leave that testimony with you in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen.
Friends, I'm so excited for our continued reasoning and relating as we start our African American history unit next week with some of the same principles and others that I think will be also very, very tender and important for us. So thank you so much. Let's see. What about Logan? Would you leave us with a prayer, please, my friend? Thank you.
Dear Heavenly Father, we're so grateful for this day and we're grateful that we can this class, and so that we will be able to travel home safely, and thus we can take these principles that we learn into our daily lives, and we can teach others, and thus anyone who is in need of thy help, and may love thee and save things in Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much. Thank you, friends. Have a wonderful day. Look forward to seeing you next week.